Welcome to the podcast summary of David Cameron. David Cameron's record is one of those political stories that keeps circling back to the same tension. Modern image, old networks, big promises, messy consequences. He helped reshape the Conservatives, steered Britain through a coalition, pushed austerity, called the Brexit referendum that ended his premiership, and then later reappeared in frontline politics after a very awkward detour through private finance. If you want the short version, a lot of his biggest decisions worked in the near term and then cast a much longer shadow. Cameron came into office in 2010 without a majority, so he did something Britain had not seen since the Second World War and formed a coalition government with Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrats. That gave him a working Commons majority of 76 seats, and for a while, an image of practical, calmer politics after the financial crisis. The coalition opened the door to some big constitutional and social changes, including the referendum on the alternative vote and later same-sex marriage. But the AV referendum failed, and that defeat badly hurt the Liberal Democrats, who ended up paying a huge political price for being the junior partner. Cameron's premiership also became the age of referendums. There was AV in 2011, Scottish independence in 2014, and the EU vote in 2016. He backed the no side in the first two and won both. On the third one, the one that mattered most for his own future, he lost. Austerity was the core economic story of the Cameron years. He presented it as necessary deficit reduction after the 2008 crash, arguing that Britain had to get its finances under control while shielding the NHS and education as much as possible. Public spending was cut by roughly 5% of GDP during the coalition period, and by 2015 the structural deficit had been about halved. There were also numbers Cameron's side could point to with some confidence. Unemployment fell from around 7.9% in 2010 to 5.5%, and employment rose by roughly 2.45 million jobs. At the same time, the national debt still climbed from about 71% to 84% of GDP by 2016, which undercut the simple story that austerity would quickly fix the books. Critics argued the government tightened too early and weakened growth. So even where the deficit improved, the broader economy paid a price. The sharpest arguments landed around welfare reform. Universal credit and the so-called bedroom tax were sold as ways to encourage work and reduce spending. But studies linked those changes to welfare losses and damaging social effects, especially in poorer communities, which is where the abstract language of fiscal discipline hit real households very directly. Cameron never wanted to sound like a tribute act to Thatcherism. He pitched himself as a modern, compassionate conservative, a one-nation figure, socially liberal, less ideological, and more interested in whether government could make life feel better, not only richer. That showed up in things like the big society, academy, and free school expansion, the pupil premium, and even the idea that happiness and general well-being mattered alongside economic growth. The clearest example was same-sex marriage in England and Wales. Cameron argued that backing marriage equality was a conservative position because it supported commitment and stability, which was a very deliberate attempt to redefine what conservatism could sound like. It passed, even though more conservative MPs voted against it than for it, which tells you a lot about both his authority and the limits of it. Critics on the right thought he had blurred conservatism into something barely distinguishable from the established left. Supporters thought he had figured out that a party can't keep talking, like it's still in the last century, and expect everyone else to politely wait. Cameron made the EU referendum a central conservative manifesto pledge, even though he personally supported staying in a reformed European Union. Then in June 2016, Leave won by about 52% to 48% on a 72% turnout. And that was that. He resigned almost immediately, saying he could not be the captain taking Britain to a destination he had opposed. That line stuck because it was blunt, and by that stage, basically undeniable. What made the whole episode more damaging was what came out later. A parliamentary committee described his refusal to allow civil service Brexit contingency planning as gross negligence. So this was not only a gamble that failed, it was also a gamble where the backup plan had been treated like bad vibes. Cameron later said he did not regret holding the referendum, but also said he was hugely depressed by the result and thought about its consequences every day. On foreign policy, Cameron combined a liberal interventionist instinct with a strong preference for acting through institutions like NATO, the UN, the G8, and the EU. He was proud of Britain's role in the 2011 Libya intervention and the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. But a later Foreign Affairs Committee inquiry was deeply critical. It said the threat to civilians had been overstated, that regime change emerged without proper post-war planning, and that Libya's collapse helped create space for Islamic State in North Africa. Then there was Syria, where Cameron hit a historic wall in 2013 when MPs rejected military action. He became the first British Prime Minister since 1782 to lose a foreign policy vote in the Commons. He later did get approval for airstrikes against Islamic State in Iraq and, in 2015, Syria, although British pilots had already taken part in Syria operations without a Commons vote. It all added up to a record that sounded principled in theory, but kept colliding with the hard question of what happens after the intervention, and who really owns the aftermath. Cameron's public image was always shadowed by his background. Eton, Oxford, the Bullingdon Club, inherited wealth around the family, and a political world full of familiar surnames and old-school connections. He later said he regretted joining the Bullingdon Club and cringed at that famous photo of what he called sons of privilege, but the image never really left him. His attempt to make the Conservatives look modern and inclusive kept running into accusations that the top of government still looked like an old boy network with better tailoring. Then came the Panama Papers, which showed he had invested in his father's offshore fund and sold the shares for a £19,000 profit before becoming Prime Minister. He said he had paid UK tax and done nothing improper, but it fed the Dodgy Dave label and sharpened public suspicion. After leaving office, that suspicion got a much bigger boost with Greensill Capital. Cameron became an advisor, reportedly earned around $10 million before the company collapsed, and was paid more than $1 million a year for roughly 25 days of work, plus share options. In 2020, he lobbied former colleagues, texted Rishi Sunak, and met senior civil servants to push for Greensill to get access to government-backed COVID financing. Sunak turned down his direct request, but another scheme still exposed taxpayers to a potential loss of about £335 million. That whole episode became a textbook case of the revolving door between high office and private finance, and investigators examined whether he had broken lobbying rules. And then, because British politics sometimes refuses to believe in clean endings, Cameron came back. In November 2023, Rishi Sunak made him Foreign Secretary and created him Baron Cameron of Chipping Norton, making him the first former Prime Minister elevated to the peerage since Margaret Thatcher. His return focused heavily on Ukraine and the Gaza war. He backed continued military aid to Ukraine, while also urging Israel to follow international humanitarian law and calling Palestinian casualties and settler violence unacceptable. But his positions also exposed some very visible tensions in British foreign policy. He supported RAF action against Iranian missiles aimed at Israel, yet said equivalent support for Ukraine could be a dangerous escalation. And he threatened the International Criminal Court with funding and treaty consequences over possible Israeli arrest warrants, which drew attention to how selective the language of international order can start to sound when allies are involved. Cameron's career is hard to file neatly because the headline changes depending on where you stop the story. Modernizer, austerity prime minister, referendum gambler, interventionist, symbol of elite politics, comeback foreign secretary, all of them fit. And maybe that's the neatest summary of all. He kept trying to manage Britain's future, and kept finding out that history is not especially manageable. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.